Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our third webinar in a four-part series. This part is very much focused on responsible labour practices, and we touched on this on the previous webinar and talked about why responsible labour practices are so important to the grape and wine sector. Today, we're presenting the findings and the learnings from a process we've undertaken. We've engaged a consultancy called Edge Impact to undertake a process to investigate the best approaches to responsible business practices for our sector. The function of the webinar today is that we'll have a couple of presenters online, Nick and Elise. There is a way that you as an attendee can ask questions. Nick and Elise will present, and then at the end of the webinar, we'll have about 20 minutes for a question and answer session. And if you wish to ask questions of the presenters, you can do so through the Q&A function, which sits on the bar at the top of the screen. And you can type in a question and we'll fill that through to Nick and Elise at the end of the webinar. To begin with, I'd like to discuss a little bit around the motivations behind why we've chosen to focus on ethical business. And really, that is for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that we recognise that for Australian grape and wine, we want to be proactive in this space. We know that there are risks for Australian horticulture in general. Australia is flagged as a moderate to high risk location for all of horticulture. And so we know that Australian wine buyers are really interested in Australian viticultural practices. We know that there's been auditors sent out by European retailers to look at what's happening within Australian viticulture, and we want to make sure that we're not exposed to that reputational risk. Additionally, we also know it's the right thing to do. We want to protect workers that work in Australian grape and wine. So to help us better understand how modern slavery may present itself within Australian grape and wine supply chains and how we can avoid and respond to it, we've asked Nick Dexter, who's the Principal Consultant in Ethical Business and Reporting at Edge Impact, and Elise Margaritas, who's the Principal Consultant in Communications at Edge Impact, to present today. Nick's background is very much focused on supply chains and risks that occur through supply chains and procurement. And Elise's background is very much focused on storytelling for purpose organisations. So we've got the heads on this, the right team to tell us exactly what modern slavery means. I'll now pass to Nick and Elise to lead us through their presentation. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you, Julian. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're coming together today. I'm joining you from the land of Naarm, that we now call Melbourne, on Wurundjeri Woi, Wurrung country of the Kulin Nation, and I extend my respect to all First Nations peoples across Australia. In acknowledging country, I recognise the deep custodianship First Nations peoples have held over these lands and skies and waterways for thousands of years. And I also acknowledge their lived experience following colonisation, including forced labour, wage theft from Indigenous Anzacs, and the exploitation endured during the stolen generations. These are among Australia's earliest examples of what we now understand to be modern slavery, with impacts that continue across generations. It's also worth noting that today is International Human Rights Day, marking the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's a timely reminder that dignity and safety and fair treatment are universal rights, which sit at the heart of our conversation today about ethical business and protecting the people behind Australian wine. So here's our plan for today. We'll start by grounding ourselves in what ethical business means in the context of Australian wine. We'll then look at how risks show up in business. What does it look like in vineyards, in wineries, across supply chains, and what actions can we take to address them? From there, we'll explore the opportunities that ethical business can unlock for the sector before we talk about the tools that we've developed through this guide that can help make that work. And then, as Julie mentioned, we'll finish with some question time. So I encourage you to make note of any questions that arise as we move through the session, enter them in the chat, thinking about how this might have implications for your own business and your own situations. I'll now hand us over to Nick to get us started.
Yeah, thank you, Julie and Elise. When Julian started talking about responsible labour practices, often people's thoughts go to what's the exact opposite of these things. And Elise has already started a bit of that framing with this use of the language around modern slavery. And when we use some of this language, sometimes people find it a little bit isolating, like not really sure what it looks like. So I just want to stop and ask, when I use this term slavery, what are the sorts of images that come to mind for you? Some of you are probably picturing imagery of things like Django from the 1800s, whips, chains, shackles, other ways in which freedom of movement in particular can be physically controlled. But in modern Australia, exploitation looks really different. It's quieter, it's more administrative, and it's often completely hidden, but sometimes right in front of us. People lose their freedom not through iron restraints, but through withheld wages, debt manipulation, threats, confiscated identity documents, or simply having no safe alternative but to keep working, even when the conditions around them are unfair or unsafe. Modern slavery is not one crime. It includes deceptive recruitment, forced labour, debt bondage, and the worst forms of child labour. And what ties these together is the UN protocol, the Palermo Convention on Forced Labour, which tells us that modern slavery is when freedom is removed through deception or coercion, and one person is exploited for the benefit of someone else's gain. Globally, the ILO estimates that there are 49.6 million people living in modern slavery, and that's more than at the time of abolition in 1865. It equates to around 1 in every 165 people on the planet, and vulnerability is rising due to increased conflict, climate pressures, and economic hardship. And that's not a global dynamic, that's also affecting us here in Australia. For an industry like wine, with seasonal workforces, contractor reliance, long hours due to vintage, and significant labour mobility, these risks are not abstract. They exist within the same systems that support our vineyards, wineries, and its supply chains. And here in Australia, an estimated 41,000 people are living in conditions of exploitation. That's almost twice the population of the Barossa Valley. So acknowledging that this risk exists is not a radical act, it's a statement of fact. And as business leaders, we need to shift the conversation from how we'll be perceived if we are transparent about that to what it will look like if we're seen to be doing nothing about it. As you can imagine from the definition that I've shared around modern slavery, not all labour abuses are slavery. When we look at the spectrum of exploitation, Elise, you can change your slide if you like, it's important to remember that this isn't about drawing sharp lines between good and bad work or determining exactly where modern slavery begins. No one experiences their lives in academic categories, and that includes workers. I'm yet to meet a worker who says, I think I'm experiencing ILO indicators of forced labour 5 and 7. They experience their life, including their work lives, on a continuum, a gradual shift in the conditions around them. At one end is decent work, what we all aspire to have for ourselves and for the people around us. Safe, lawful, fairly paid, respectful. At the other end is modern slavery, where a person's freedom is removed through deception or coercion. But what's really important about the continuum, and the bit that probably the most important piece of this entire day, if this is all you get out, this is the bit that I would like you to hear, is that everything that happens in the in-between, the space where vulnerabilities emerge. And what these vulnerabilities look like can exist anywhere. Inconsistent pay or unclear deductions, long hours without adequate rest during the peak season, workers who don't feel safe raising concerns, dependency on labour hire contractor or employer provided accommodation, language barriers or social isolation, poor visibility over subcontracting. None of these things on their own need to be modern slavery to warrant our attention. But they are points on the continuum where a worker becomes less able to protect themselves and where risks can escalate when no one's watching. And that's why the spectrum is such a helpful tool. It shifts the conversation from, is this modern slavery, to where might vulnerabilities be forming? What can we do now to prevent them from deepening? For the wine industry and everyone within it, this is particularly relevant. Seasonal work, dispersed work sites, long days during vintage, a reliance on contractors, all create moments where conditions can slip without anyone intending harm. By mapping vulnerabilities across the continuum, businesses of all shapes and sizes can target their due diligence strategically to strengthen induction and supervision, to tighten contractor oversight, to improve accommodation standards, creating clear, trusted channels for workers to speak up if they need to, and checking that people are paid correctly and lawfully. Done well, this process is proactive rather than reactive. It's about identifying early signals, building resilience into our labour systems, and ensuring that every worker, whether here for one day or for several months, experiences dignity, safety, and fairness. And so the spectrum isn't about labels, it's a framework to guide better decisions and earlier actions. But why do we need earlier actions? As an aspiring pracademic, I think it's important to be conscious that these aren't abstract ideas. These harms affect real people in environments that look remarkably similar to the work many of us oversee every day. Elise, you can change your slide if you like. The Joseph Matamata case is confronting because it illustrates in human terms what this looks like when our safeguards fail. 13 predominantly Samoan workers, some as young as 12, arrived into New Zealand believing that they were stepping into good horticultural jobs. What they actually stepped into was complete dependency on one man. He controlled where they worked, where they slept, when they ate, whether they got paid, and whether they were allowed to leave. They worked up to 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, without any wages. They were isolated, their vulnerabilities were exploited, and when they resisted, they were punished, physically and pretty brutally. These were not abstract victims. They were parents, teenagers, trying to build a better life. And the case is not an outlier from a bygone era. He was sentenced in 2020. And the context of how he operated mirrors the early signs that we're seeing in the Australian agriculture system today. workers who don't know who their employer is, some prevalence of cash payments without records, overcrowded accommodation, subcontractors who cannot be located, and people who are simply too afraid to speak up. The Fair Work Ombudsman's recent findings show non-compliance rates of up to 83% in regions across Australia, and the same patterns of vulnerability throughout the labour hire system. And this is a really critical insight. Matamata didn't start with violence. He started with promises, he started with dependency, confusion, and he was enabled by a system that lacked oversight. By the time the harm was made visible, the exploitation was fully entrenched. And this is why due diligence really matters, not as a paperwork exercise, but as the thing that makes a real difference in someone's life. Because when a business doesn't know who is employing the workers on its land, when subcontracting isn't monitored, when no one checks conditions or talks to the workers to understand their lived experiences, when pay slips aren't issued, when people feel unsafe raising concerns, that's when risk can become harm. Until one day, the situation resembles the Matamata case more closely than anyone would ever imagine possible. We don't share this case to shock. It's here to remind us that exploitation becomes real when people disappear into the gaps in our systems. And those gaps, unlike Matamata's conduct, are entirely within our control to fix. We're going to want to talk about the systems a bit more generally. We are now seeing real harms being documented in agriculture sectors that sit right alongside wine. Sectors that share labour pools, labour hire networks, seasonal pressures, and regional workforces. Recent investigations, including the reporting on the New South Wales blueberry industry, revealed a pattern very similar that should feel pretty familiar to us. Workers being cycled through opaque subcontracting chains, widespread underpayment, poor accommodation, almost no visibility over who is actually employing the people on the ground. Some of those caps will start to feel familiar to you. A core driver of this is a lack of a consistent national regulation labour hire framework. In many parts of horticulture, anyone can set up a labour hire operation with minimal scrutiny. And when regulation is patchy, oversight becomes difficult. Growers unknowingly inherit risks created entirely by third parties. When these failures hit the media, they don't get confined to a crop. Retailers, importers, and regulators, both here and internationally, look at the whole agricultural landscape and ask, where else could this be happening? And increasingly, that scrutiny is turning towards Australian wine. From a buyer's perspective, they don't see individual crops necessarily. They see a labour system with shared vulnerabilities and shared reputational exposure. The Australian grape and wine products are now often categorised as moderate to high risk in global assessments. And even if a business is doing the right thing within its own operations, labour hire gaps elsewhere in the system can still create exposure for the sector overall. And that's exactly why Wine Australia has been investing in this work with Edge Impact. Not because the industry is currently failing, but because expectations are starting to shift. Export markets, retailers, and regulators want evidence that the risks are understood and that they're being managed. And the work we're doing within the soon-to-be released Ethical Business Guide is laying the foundations that will hopefully help us to articulate clearer oversight, better systems, and the practical tools that can become consistent within individual businesses' responses to the vulnerabilities to fill those gaps within the seasonal work and unregulated labour hire system. Acting ethically protects your license to operate. It builds trust with your customers, and it strengthens the competitiveness of the Australian wine sector generally. We can't solve a problem that we don't understand. And so one of the first artifacts that you'll find within the Ethical Business Guide is this reference on what does the risk look like across the value chain. When it comes to labour risk, one of the biggest challenges we have is that we only see the parts of the system that are directly in front of us. If we only think of risk as what happens on the farm with pruning crews, picking teams, we miss the full picture. Vulnerability doesn't actually attach itself to one job or to one task. It moves through the value chain, shaped by how work is organised, who performs it, and how visible those arrangements are. To understand where risk emerges, people like myself look at an industry through 4 risk lenses. The first of those lenses is high-risk business models. These are practices that reduce visibility, layers of subcontracting, informal and unregulated labour hire, rapid scaling during vintage, and aggressive pricing. Any model that erodes transparency increases vulnerability is the general rule of thumb. The second lens that we look at is high-risk geographies. And it's easy to think of labour risk as an international versus a domestic problem, looking for high-risk geographies from an international lens and saying, hey, do workers have the same protection as us? But actually within Australia, worker protections vary by state. As I've already articulated, New South Wales has no labour hire contracting scheme. And we have evidence that when an actor becomes subject to investigation in southeast Queensland, what they do is shut up shop and move south across the border into our region. Also within Australia, remoteness functions like a high-risk geography, limiting oversight, limiting access to support services, the tying of your work to your accommodation. That isolation makes it more difficult for workers to seek help. Distance both reduces vulnerability and increases isolation of the worker. And so risk rises. The third lens that we look to is high-risk categories. These are areas of the value chain that rely heavily on casual, agency, or contracted labour. In wine, that includes vineyard work, yes, but also bottling and packaging, warehousing, transport, and cellar door hospitality. Risk doesn't stop at the farm gate by any means. And the fourth lens is vulnerable populations. These are workers who, because of their circumstances, face disproportionate risks. Migrant and visa workers, people in remote regions, women and new arrivals, younger people, and labour hire employees in unregulated states. When these vulnerabilities overlap, for example, a migrant worker in a remote region hired informally through a subcontractor, that risk escalates quite quickly. When we apply these 4 lenses to the wine value chain, we start to see that risk is not confined to one part of the industry, but part of the industry overall. And so when you receive your copy of the Ethical Business Guide, the intention is to be able to look at this articulation of the industry overall and start to understand our relationship to the risk, not just the ability to identify the risk. The overall intention of this is to be able to understand, why are our customers asking us about this piece of the puzzle? Where else does this risk exist? Who can we learn from? And who perhaps can we help in their own journey? We'd be a pretty mean partner if all we did was help you identify and spot risks along the value chain and didn't tell you what you can actually do about it. So the next big lift within the guide is all about the practical actions that you can take. These are simple, realistic steps that any grower, producer, or business in the value chain can take, regardless of your size or resources. And the very good news is that addressing labor risks doesn't begin with complex audits or expensive systems. It starts with 5, I think, pretty clear principles to help strengthen visibility, build trust, and reduce vulnerability within your workforce. I do want to really stress that when we talk about your workforce, we are talking about the people who provide the labor required for your business. Your workforce is not just the people that you directly employ, it's the people that you rely on. And so principle 1 is about making a commitment to respecting human rights. And what a wonderful day to do it on. This is about signaling that we take this seriously, that we expect good practice from our partners, and that we're willing to act when something isn't right. Now, when we talk about making a commitment to respect human rights, often we're thinking of a glossy human rights policy that someone like Coles, Woolworths, Metcash might put out. But your version of this could be as simple as something that you hang on your own website or put into your contracts. Principle 2 is about knowing your workforce. That means not just who is on your site, but who actually employs them. How were they recruited? What conditions are they working under? And whether they feel safe. Knowing your workforce, we often think about the need for a third party to come in and do a social audit. Knowing your workforce, if you're a small operator, means walking the field, having a look at the workers who are picking the grapes. Do they look as you expect them to? Do they look like they're being treated with dignity and respect? Do they have the normal things that you'd expect them to have relevant to the work being performed? Can I talk with them? It's not about that we only want to employ people that speak English, but it is to say that if their only way to communicate is via their contractor, that's an understanding of the level of vulnerability that person may experience. Principle 3 is helping people to understand their rights and empowering them to speak up. If workers don't know what good looks like, they can't tell you when something is wrong. And if they don't feel safe reporting concerns, then issues stay hidden. Now, when we talk about helping people to understand their rights, this can be as simple as part of your induction plan, understanding the workers that are coming on site, going to the Work Rights Hub that's got free resources managed by the Red Cross, and handing out a pamphlet in the language relevant to the workforce there. What's really powerful about that is that doesn't just protect the workers while they're with you on that day, it gives them an understanding of their rights that they can enforce elsewhere when they go and work somewhere else within the region or perhaps within another region, acknowledging that workers within your sector are highly mobile. Principle 4 is creating safe, healthy, and accessible workplaces. And this is the basics done well. It starts with a proper induction, it starts with decent housing, starts with fair rostering, PPE and rest breaks, shade, access to water, and safe equipment. It's a space where most risks can be prevented long before they escalate. I want to just hover over decent housing for a moment and go, you may not be, you're very unlikely to be the person providing housing. But if you are aware that you have workers that are visitors to your region and that housing is being provided and that they're reliant on that housing for the time that they're on your site, then perhaps once a season, going and having a look at what that housing looks like, and does that meet your expectations? or is it worth a conversation with the labour hire provider? And principle 5 is paying people fairly and on time. And it sounds simple, but underpayment is one of the strongest predictors of broader exploitation. Getting this right protects workers, it protects your business, and it protects the industry's reputation. Paying fairly and on time doesn't just mean paying the workers directly fairly on time, it means paying within the system fairly and on time. Businesses experiencing financial stress sometimes have very few options to reduce their costs. And if they don't have the cash in the bank, are they in a position to pay the workers fairly and on time also? Taken together, these 5 principles are not about perfection. They're about building a culture where harm is harder to hide and easier to prevent. And the guide breaks each of these down into simple practical actions that any producer can take straight away, no matter the scale of their operation. If we invest in helping people to understand their rights and empowering them to speak up, we may experience a moment in the life of our business where someone speaks up about a harm that we need to help them address. And in terms of formal systems, some of you might have been asked by a buyer, what's your plan around grievance and remediation? This is kind of the processes that they're talking about. As a large buyer, you want to know that if workers speak up, that they've got a channel to safety. And a channel to safety isn't about a long policy document. It's about stopping for a moment and asking yourself, if a worker identified themselves to you tomorrow that their passport was being held or they hadn't been paid, what can you actually do? Who would you need to call? How would you make them safe? And who else might need to be involved? And the obvious one is, we've got the outlet of 000. If we feel that someone is under threat of direct harm, but sometimes that may not feel like the appropriate action. And so just stopping and thinking about who you might need within your system to protect a worker might be something that's worth a bit of head scratching on. What's really important to recognize is that when something does go wrong, none of us have time to sit down and design a process from scratch. We fall back on whatever thinking we've already done. And that's why having a simple 5-step framework might matter in a moment of crisis. Step 1 is about protecting the worker. Making sure that they're safe, making sure that they're not left alone with the person that's causing harm and not put at further risk. Further risk might mean identifying them to a third party. So if we're going to identify them to a third party, making sure that that third party is appropriate and that the worker has agency over that decision to be identified. Step 2 is to understand what happened. Now, you don't need to run a full internal investigation. I'm not expecting any of you to crack out the monocle or your detective kit. But you do need to have a plan in place to listen carefully and gather enough information to know what the worker is experiencing. Because if we don't understand the problem, then we're not going to be able to help solve it. Step 3 is to respond with influence. Sometimes the issue won't be within your direct control. It may sit with a labour hire provider, a supervisor, or a subcontractor. If you're a retailer, it may sit with a member of your supply chain. Your role is to use your leverage to ensure that the situation is addressed quickly and appropriately. Step 4 is to remedy the harm. Now, when we talk about remedy in a human rights context, we're talking about restoring a person to the state that they were in before the harm occurred. And so if a person has been underpaid, unsafe or mistreated, part of your responsibility is supporting a pathway to make right, whether that's back pay, safe accommodation, or connecting them to specialized services. And I want to be really clear, this is about ensuring that the person is supported through their remedy. This is not necessarily that you are the person that needs to give them back pay, but you might be a responsible actor to leverage that remedy being made available to the worker. I'm sure that some of you will have questions about that. So just a reminder that somewhere in the chat, you've got the ability to ask questions, and happy to scratch at that a little bit more later. And step 5 is to prevent future harm by looking at what does the system look like that this event happened in, and is it possible for it to reoccur? Was it in a hiring gap? Was it in a visibility gap? Was it in a communication gap? Did I not actually tell my subcontractor my expectations clearly enough? Do I not have enough accountability mechanisms to check in on that subcontractor? And adjusting the system appropriately so that the harm doesn't reoccur. And the key point about all of this is that it's not about policies, it's about preparedness. It's about making sure that if something does go wrong, we know what to do, you know who you need to involve, that you have the right relationships and partnerships around you to support the worker and to resolve the issue safely. Thinking about this ahead of time is what buyers and regulators want to see. It's not perfection, it's a thoughtful, practical approach that protects people and also protects your business. Elise is now going to go through a little bit about what's the business value of that ethical business can help unlock.
Thanks, Nick. Ethical business is absolutely about reducing risk and preventing harm, but it also opens doors to opportunity because when done well, it's an additional lever that strengthens the future of Australian wine and the resilience of Australian wine in the industry. Number one, it protects the reputation and trust that the industry has worked really hard to build, both here and overseas. It positions the sector to meet rapidly tightening domestic and international legislation and regulations, which is increasingly shaping access to export markets. It improves workforce stability because it attracts and retains skilled, reliable labour. And when working conditions are safe and fair, people stay and they return and they come back. And so seasonal teams become more predictable. It helps to meet retailer and customer expectations across Australia and around the world. And these expectations are no longer optional, they're a real ticket to play. And finally, it demonstrates credibility. Certifications, audits, and due diligence processes that we can undertake will become easier and more attainable when those basic foundations of ethical business are already in place. So ethical business helps to strengthen the sector's footing overall. It builds resilience, trust, and also secures that long-term opportunity. But we know that this work can feel really complex. And so the Ethical Business Guide includes a suite of simple, practical tools to help make putting practice into place a lot easier. And so within the guide, you will find things like a contractor checklist, which will help you ask the right information of your contractors to ensure that labour providers are meeting those legal and ethical standards. We have prepared a contractor conversation guide that supports you to ask clear questions and navigate issues when they arise. It can feel uncomfortable, so being prepared is going to allow you to put the best foot forward if something does happen. And so it's designed to remove any guesswork and to create confident, or to empower you to have confident and respectful conversations. We have an induction checklist that helps ensure that every worker understands what their rights are, what they need to know, and really importantly, in a language that they can understand. We heard that a lot through our stakeholder engagement, that English is a second language, and so creating accessible information will be really key. There are also site posters that you can display in common areas that can again be translated into the workers' languages to help everyone understand their rights and where they can go for help. And finally, we have developed a communications handbook to be read alongside, in complement to the ethical business guide, to support you in talking about ethical business in a way that is accurate and clear and aligned with sector expectations. So all of these tools have been tried and tested over many years of experience, and they're designed to be picked up and used straight away. The guide has been shaped for anyone who grows or makes or moves or sells wine, and it's designed to meet you where you are, no matter how big or small your organisation is or how sophisticated your approach. We need a guide like this because modern slavery and worker exploitation does occur in Australia. Expectations are rising quickly, and the sector is being asked to not only show product quality, but how it's supporting its people. And most importantly, it captures the real conditions and challenges that are experienced every day across the sector, because of those consultations that we had undertaken. So this guide belongs to you because it was created and crafted by you. So we'd now like to open to questions. This is a space for curiosity and for testing any ideas. So we welcome all of your thoughts. And to help spark some thinking, we have a couple of provocations on screen. So please feel free to enter any questions in the chat. I don't know, Julian, if any questions have popped up.
No questions so far. Please feel free to use the Q&A function if you'd like to forward a question to Elise or Nick. I think to begin with, what you've articulated really well through this presentation, and thanks for that, Nick and Elise, is that we understand the market drivers and the human side of this. Sometimes we hear questions around why do we need additional guidance beyond what already exists within Australian law? And I guess from your perspective, it'd add to the conversation, I think, to explain a little bit around what laws there are in place and also some of the gaps that exist between law and practice.
Yeah, I guess just stepping outside of that, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights are really clear that there are quite separate responsibilities for a government organisation and for governments as opposed to businesses. Governments have a responsibility to protect human rights. Businesses have a responsibility to respect human rights, and people who are harmed have an entitlement to access to remedy. Collectively, these three principles are referred to as the Ruggie principles. Now, within Australia, we have a variety of different laws that protect our rights, from even just down to anti-discrimination laws. But within each of these policy settings, both at the federal level and at the state level, there are little quirks and little gaps, and they're not all accidents. Some of them are very intentional. We have a palm worker scheme because we have a requirement for workers in Australia to do work that our domestic workforce cannot fill. And when those workers are here, actually we need a level of stability within that system. And so we've created environments that say, hey, you can come in from the Pacific Islands as part of the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme. But when you're here, here is where we need you to work, and we're going to limit your mobility while you do so. Now, that's not accidental. That's the system doing exactly what it's designed to do, giving us access to labour to perform a function for us. And we've set controls around that mobility because that's what our labour system is requiring of that worker. Unfortunately, that has an impact on that worker being able to defend their rights. If to defend their rights, they need to, they can't move to a different employer. And if they do remove themselves from that employer, they have to go home. That has a direct implication on their ability to defend their rights. And so for a business to respect their rights, we have an opportunity to provide leverage to increase the protections around that worker. Does that make sense, Julian?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think it's important to mention as well that within Sustainable Wine Growing Australia, the handbook has some guidance around responsible business practices, and that this guide is very much built to complement what's already within the Sustainable Wine Growing Australia handbook. It's not separate to it, it's in addition to it, and it's for those that really want to extend their responsibility and be a leader within this space, but also those that are seeking further information, further clarification. And I think the guide provides a really sound justification and a very clear picture of the risks that are posed to the Australian grape and wine sector. I think, Nick, you mentioned before around that risks show up in different ways. What are the implications of geography on risk? How does it show up differently across the industry?
Yeah, so risk map to business models, so subcontracting, seasonality, pricing pressure, which vary by industry, but geography matters both because of remoteness and oversight, but also there's a very clear link to the business models at play. So if we look at the way in which wine is produced and the access to labour, say, in Adelaide and the surrounding regions, that's very different to the type of production that happens in the Sunraysia region and the labour requirements there. So the types of gangs that work in different regions across Australia have very different dynamics, from a largely domestic workforce to a largely international workforce, to workers that speak very good English, to workers who are here temporarily and have no need to have learnt English. But so yeah, there's the link between both the type of production at play. Are you a really large producer that has very stable employment practices? What is the level of seasonality in terms of your needs for labour? And who do you actually have access to support that labour piece? Again, there's the link to the actual protections at place as well. So the lack of the lack of controls around labour contractors in New South Wales has been repeatedly called out, both by the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner, the Australian Anti-Slavery Commissioner, the Australian Human Rights Commissioner, as a real gap in the architecture around worker protections, and that has a very clear geographic fingerprint in terms of the vulnerabilities that workers experience.
that makes
So
sense.
it's a really complex mix of how labor of how vulnerability maps to geographies, not just in an international level, but across the different regions of Australia.
Okay, that makes sense. I guess we're in an age where we're looking at AI, we're looking at new technology that's coming online. Does technology have a role to play here in terms of compliance or helping workers voice their concerns?
Absolutely does. So my PhD is actually in the use of a worker voice technology to help understand workers' experiences of their lives and how that maps to particularly their work life. So the big thing that I talk about when it comes to technology is that we're talking about the really big players that need to scale an ability to understand their workforce. If you're a really small player, don't invest in an app. Invest in better shoes and go for a walk and talk to people. If you're a TWE or a really large player or a really large buyer of wine, technology can play an amazing role in connecting you to the lived experiences of your workers. So this can look like QR codes in the worker accommodation. Tell us about your experience since you arrived in Australia. Doing that in a way that protects their anonymity, respects their data rights. I mean, that's pretty topical today, given everything that's going on with Meta and the bans on social media for young people. But technology can be a real enabler for our understanding of who workers are, how they are employed, and give us really nuanced understanding of the vulnerabilities at play. So when we do things like we send a social auditor in, a social auditor can look at the architecture immediately in front of them, and they can look at things like, hey, show us your pay slips, show us that these workers are actually being paid. What looking at a pay slip doesn't tell you is who is in control of the account that this money is going into. Does the worker owe a debt to someone before they even arrived into this architecture? And it's not to say that you have a responsibility to ensure that they've got the agency, but it is your responsibility to understand how vulnerable this worker may actually be. And if we have a misunderstanding of the vulnerability, then our tools to address that vulnerability will never be adequate. And so that's the real power of technology. If we can understand people better, we can understand the context that they're working within and the vulnerabilities at play, then we can build better solutions to address those vulnerabilities. Some other cool technologies that are out there. A really topical one for the wine industry, I think, is just traceability. That if we're going to say that Australian wine is more ethical, then our ability to defend that the wine in the bottle is truly ours becomes even more important, right? In the same way that that's important for provenance claims and defending our relationship with land and the styles of production here in Australia, ethical production can become another pillar to that brand identity. And therefore, tools like forensic science that can prove the origin of products become even more important to us.
Fantastic. I think we'll stop there. We've got a couple minutes left, and so I think it'll be helpful to just let people know when the ethical business guide will be available, and talk a little bit about those next steps in terms of when can we expect a copy of the ethical business guide, noting that Wine Australia will have this on our website. And we'll be promoting this through newsletters and social media to let people know. And a copy of this, a recording of this webinar will go out to all attendees, as will if Nick and Elise are happy to share, as I'm sure they're on their slide deck, to help complement.
But just before we wrap up, Nick spoke clearly about the need to protect the worker as a first priority, and how in a situation of stress or crisis, we will often fall back on our most basic level of training or awareness. And so if you do find yourself in a situation where you need some support, we've included here some of the organisations that can help. So I'd recommend you keeping a note of these handy so that you do feel confident to have a first port of call for support if something does happen. And as Julie mentioned, we'll share these slides. They'll be available for download along with the recording of this webinar as soon as next week, I imagine. And then we'll provide notification for when the Ethical Business Guide and Supporting Comms Guide can then be accessed in the new year.
Fantastic. Thanks all. Please feel free to contact me directly, Chris, and I can forward your questions on to Nick and Elise. Thanks for joining, everyone, and thank you to Nick and Elise for a fantastic presentation.